I have strict instructions from my good friends, the moderators, not to exceed 15 minutes or else. So I will not rehash the facts of urbanization for you. We've heard them yesterday. We've heard them before. We are more than 50% urban, and the most rapidly urbanizing regions of the world are in the global south, Africa, and South Asia particularly. And this is what our world looks like at the moment. We are battling several contrasting and contradicting trends. We have sprawl on one end. We have overcrowding and slums on the other end. We have the urbanization of poverty. We have high levels of energy consumption. We have high levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have an increasing and increasingly frequent and increasingly intense natural disasters, the impacts of climate change, as well as man-made disasters and conflicts in our world today. I'm going to take you on a little historic tour of three cities. We already heard a little bit from Pietro on how we started here in Istanbul 40 years ago, in Stockholm 40 years ago with the summit, the UN Conference on the Human Environment, which talked about the link between environment and development, which sharpened the focus, which talked about natural resources, biodiversity, but also talked about adequate shelter, and also talked about water and sanitation. So that was really the starting point in discussing human settlements. And then in 1992, we went to Rio, where we got the Agenda 21. Which really talked about the local issues related to environment and development and provided a blueprint for action for us. And we went quite soon after to Istanbul, where we got the Habitat Agenda. So it's really a fascinating journey. And after that, we went back to Rio in 2012, exactly 1 year ago, when again we were talking about the conference on sustainable development, eradicating poverty, etc. And we are back in Stockholm. So it's really been a fascinating journey. But it is no accident, and it's not for historical documentation that I'm mentioning these three cities to you today. In the here and now, the significance of these three cities is far more than their historical trajectory. In the here and now, these three cities have emerged as symbols of something else, of problematic, place-based or place-related concerns. This is Istanbul less than a month ago. I'm sure all of you have seen these pictures. You have not. Our living rooms have been full of images, full of news from the Gezi Park protests. Our Facebook accounts have been flooded. Our Twitter accounts have been flooded. We have Turkish friends who are asking for support. We have colleagues. We have mobilization of different types happening. Basically, it started as a protest over redevelopment of a public space in the center of Istanbul. It was about the commercialization, the privatization of a space that had been essentially public. It spread to wider issues of democracy, spread to wider issues of voice and choice. It was not an Arab Spring in the sense that people were not fighting for democracy in a place where there was none, but they were actually fighting for democracy to come down to local governance level and for them to have a voice. We have democracy, but still we cannot influence local decisions. That was the sense of Istanbul. And then we had Rio and other Brazilian cities. And I was very pleased to hear the comment at the end of the previous session from our colleague from Brazil who said, you know, have you thought about it? Well, I have, and a number of my colleagues have. And again, the trigger was a 20-cent rise in public transport fares, but the issues became much larger. The issues were that cities and national governments are investing in glitzy infrastructure, which is not for everyone, and at the cost of services and infrastructure that is for everyone. So that really is the central issue. And again, issues of corruption, issues of transparency, issues of lack of a voice and local governance. So that was Rio for you, and this is closer home. Without being rude to my hosts and without oversimplifying the argument, it started as a police incident, but then again led into concerns and protests by youth and by people who are protesting conditions of exclusion, of segregation, of unemployment of different types. And let us not forget several other cities. In my city, in Delhi, where I come from, there was unprecedented, really, public protests from over the last year as the year changed, December and January. Many of you would have heard the case of this young woman who was raped and gang raped and murdered in the city of Delhi. She was abducted from a bus stop, a public space, in the evening at 9 o'clock, not too late, and she was brutally tortured and killed. People came out in the droves, people protested, people voiced their concern, and I'm very happy to say that led to some changes in the law. But this was really about safety in a public space. And we've had riots in London by disaffected youth in 2011. We've had riots in Athens because of economic decline and unemployment and people out there. And the most famous ones, of course, have been in the banlieues of Paris in 2005. Where really it was about people living in social housing estates in the suburbs of Paris, talking about the lack of infrastructure, the lack of services, the lack of open spaces, the lack of employment opportunities, really the lack of any kinds of opportunities to make the best of an urban life. There are several factors what bind these cases together. These are certainly the three that I find most significant. Several cities in the last 10 years, not just these cities that I've named, have faced protests, have faced riots, have faced violence, initiated by people who have felt marginalized or excluded from governance processes, and who have felt that they have not been able to make enough of the opportunities for progress that cities offer. And I will come to that in a second. Our colleagues said yesterday, the significant thing is that these are happening in public spaces. But of course, they're happening in public spaces. But there are two significant things. One is they're happening in public spaces closer to home. And second is that they're happening about public spaces. And when I say public spaces, I extend that to include public services, public infrastructure. This is the crux of it, a sense of exclusion, real or perceived, from all of these services, all of these spaces, and all of these opportunities. Clearly, the last century's model of urbanization and planning and development, and planners have to take a lot of the blame as well, I must say, has led to a high degree of fragmentation, spatial, economic, as well as social. So we say cities are homes of opportunity and beacons of hope, but not for all. Cities are melting pots, but increasingly you see people living more and more in their own communities, segregated, separated, not engaging. Cities are center of innovation and creativity, but not harnessing everybody's innovation and everybody's creativity. That is the problem. There's a high degree of social fragmentation, spatial fragmentation, economic fragmentation, and one leads to the other. So a gated community is a classic example of all three. It's economic, it's spatial, and it's social. How do we go about building an inclusive city then, if it's all so challenging and all so difficult? I'd say there are three dimensions to it. I think building an inclusive fabric, building an inclusive urban fabric, an inclusive community, and an inclusive economy, which my colleague spoke to a few minutes ago in Detroit, is really the heart of the discussion. The urban fabric, and it can be done in so many ways. We talked about fine grain and coarse grain, and I'm sorry to disappoint with no maps and no beautiful drawings as we saw yesterday, but really some principles on mixing up the traditional segregated land use and uses, economic uses and use zones. You can forget about having, single-use districts or monofunctional, streets or roads or infrastructure. Combining different types of urban form, combining different types of modes of transport and mobility, pedestrian, cars, public transport, motorized, non-motorized, etc. A mix of public and private spaces, a mix of natural and built environment. You can no longer have just one large park in the city where everybody goes to. You have to we are talking about interconnected green spaces and things like that. And I'd like to say two things here, really, most important things to keep in mind. One, I said already, is to include widen the definition of public space to include public services and public infrastructure. Because when you go through a metro in a Delhi or a Mumbai or a London or a wherever, what are you doing? You're essentially navigating a public space or a series of public spaces, the station, the platform, the train itself, and then you get out, and then you get out to the street. I mean, it's really a series of public spaces. So to exclude public infrastructure from that discussion on public spaces would not be really smart. And the second thing to and I know I risk making some enemies among our urban designer and landscaping friends here, to really avoid over-landscaping and over-beautification of public spaces. Over-landscape public spaces can ironically have the effect of being exclusionary, intimidatory, and really not for everyone. Somebody said yesterday, I think it was Suzanne, who said, you know, in London, this sort of over-enthusiastic youngsters, teenagers are kind of sometimes seen as a threat, and that drives the vulnerable elderly people inside their homes. They don't feel comfortable in using public spaces. Well, in my city, it's exactly the opposite. And I'll tell you how. In Delhi, we have this very nice mode of participation, which is called the Residents' Welfare Associations. You know, they're the groupings of middle-class residents who come and talk about their concerns, and they have a real voice in issues. And what they do, and they're this really, you know, sort of very energetic and very interested in their community issues, particularly the maintenance of parks and gardens and the beautification of parks and gardens, which means you kick out the kids who want to play cricket in there, because they will spoil your flowers. So the poor kids are actually out on the streets again in an extremely unsafe environment, and these guys are doing their yoga or whatever in the beautifully landscaped gardens. Over-landscaped public spaces are a challenge. Leave them organic, leave them free to develop, and leave people to find their own niche in those spaces. The second dimension of building an inclusive city is building an inclusive urban community. And when I talk about the youngsters and the elderly, but there are also other contradictions to be resolved: the rich and the poor, men and women, boys and girls, the abled and the disabled, those who have a voice, those who don't, the different religions, the cultures, the races, the classes, the minorities, majorities, all of that. How do you find a space in a city which reconciles the interests of all of these groups? Until we can do that, we are not building an inclusive city. And the third part, of course, is the urban economy. I spoke about this yesterday as well in my brief intervention. A large chunk of the economy in many developing country cities is informal. How do you incorporate that with the formal economy? How do you create a mix, a balance of the formal and the informal? How do you make space? I mean, there's a vendor on a street in Delhi, there's a vendor in Rio, there's a mix of sort of formal and informal shops in the city of York. There's that last corner photograph is very interesting with the little yellow car. That's a guy selling genuinely good quality pirated CDs in Bosnia under a bombed out building. And he's doing business, you know. Do you stop him? Do you evict him? Do you let him be? When there's nothing going for that city anyway, there's no economy, do you prevent him from earning a livelihood because he's in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing the wrong kind of business? How do you reconcile these interests? How do you, and of course, the more famous ones, you know, the flower market in Amsterdam, and that's a bazaar in Kashmir, and that's the famous spice market in Delhi. Really, to combine all of these is the challenge of any city maker if you want to make an inclusive city. Some key principles. Raf talked about key principles and coming to key principles in today's discussions. I'd like to propose a few, and these are not rocket science. As my colleague said yesterday, this is not rocket science, but we still forget. We have to remind ourselves that it is really mixed uses which makes our cities vibrant and can be used to revitalize the city, especially in the 24/7 city, the kind of city that we live in now. We talk about revitalization of our historic districts and our inner city cores. We forgot. They emptied out downtowns, and now, you know, more people are stepping back in, and that's really the place which is much more inclusive. we talk about the creative and multiple uses of public spaces with greater accessibility, and I will come to accessibility. We talked about we should have interconnected open spaces rather than isolated, sort of spaces, and we saw several examples yesterday of great, wonderful cities where this is happening. But at the same time, as I said, public space is not just about parks and gardens. It's about investing in public infrastructure and public services. And it's about preventing gated communities and ghettoization and gentrification all at the same time. This is the challenge. This is the real challenge in building an inclusive city. And all of this needs greater engagement, as we've heard from Detroit, as we've heard from Iloilo City, as we've heard from Matale, as we've heard from several places, that this needs greater engagement between different groups of people. In conclusion, I'm very pleased to see you walking up the stairs at the right time. We have great expectations from planning and planners, really, to initiate change and to foster change. And as I said, public spaces, services, and infrastructure are a starting point with that. And in addition to access and accessibility, which was mentioned as a key defining feature in Professor Madanipur's excellent presentation yesterday, I'd like to add the factor of safety. Accessibility and safety are the two defining features of inclusive cities and inclusive public spaces. Safety from crime, because 75% of the women surveyed in Delhi have said that they have been either harassed, sexually assaulted, raped, or in some way or another faced these challenges of safety and crime in public spaces, on roads, on bus stops, and metros and trains, etc. Safety against road accidents, because 78% of road accident fatalities in the city of Mumbai, and this is a data from a few years ago, were pedestrians and cyclists. And safety from disasters, natural and man-made, because increasingly you see the result of climate change in urban floods and storms and centers of cities being flooded, Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Mumbai, and you see the earthquakes and you see the Christchurches of this world. So safety in those respects is extremely important, as important a dimension as accessibility in terms of public space. So when you plan or design a public space, think about that woman from a minority community who lives on a social housing estate with her 2 children and a disabled father on a single income. Will she be able to access, to use, to navigate the public space or the service that you're providing safely, easily, comfortably? In this age of metrics, and we talked about metrics yesterday, if you can tick just that one box, I think you're getting somewhere. I'd like to leave you with my favorite quote, and some of you may have heard this before. Neither cities nor places in them are unordered or unplanned. Note places and note unordered or unplanned. The question is, whose order, who's planning, and for what purpose? We do well to keep it in mind when we talk about the future of places. Thank you very much.
Thank you.